Good morning, it's Friday, September 11, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff, your favourite sports show, bringing you all the big stories in the world of sports every weekday morning. And as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top sports journos up here in Queensland with me, Jim Tucker. How are you, Jim?
Good, mate. Living the life in the bubble.
Fantastic having you back on the show. We always have a bit of fun on a Friday, and we will towards the end of the show. But we're going to start with a couple of hard-hitting news stories. Be remiss of me not to take advantage of having Jim on the show and to rip into a couple of big stories in the world of rugby union. So that's where we're going to begin. We're going to begin with a story from the Daily Telegraph today from Jamie Pandaram, which looks at a new rule which is being introduced for 2020 only, which will allow incoming Wallabies coach Dave Rennie to select 2 overseas players who don't qualify under the Ghetto law when he selects his first Wallabies squad. For those who aren't familiar with the Ghetto law, essentially you need to have played 7+ years of Super Rugby. You need to have 60+ caps at a test level representing the Wallabies to be eligible to be selected in the Wallabies team when you're playing your rugby overseas. This new variation will allow Rennie to look at some of the younger players who moved overseas, whether to England, to France, to Japan, at an earlier stage of their career, who can come in and have an instant impact in that Wallabies environment. Rennie and Rugby Australia interim CEO Rob Clark saying this is a temporary measure, it's for 2020 only. Jim, your first thoughts on the new law, how it will be, how it will be put into place, the types of players Rennie might be looking at, and whether, in fact, it might actually be a better solution long-term than the Ghetto law itself to just have 2 players from overseas in a Wallabies squad.
Well, the first thing to say is very pleased it's not open slather to create a situation where anyone who goes overseas can come back into Australian rugby and be selected for the Wallabies is a negative step. The integrity of Super Rugby, which is the showcase that we see for 6 months of the year, has to be maintained. That's what I'd firstly say. The other thing is, so much in rugby is prescriptive from world rugby, but everyone's got to believe that the Ghetto law was written by Australia. So they wrote it in the first place in 2015 to get Matt Ghetto to play for the Wallabies from his French base. So why can't they rewrite the law to serve them in a different way in 2020, which is all they're doing? And I think 2 players from overseas makes perfect sense.
Which 2 players would you be looking at, Jim? What are the gaps in the current home-based Wallabies that you think could be topped up from overseas-based players?
Well, the gaps are essentially in the same position, lock and lock. In a short space of time since the last World Cup, Australia's lost Rory Arnold to the Northern Hemisphere. Also, Adam Coleman's disappeared. And in this really murky, difficult year, Isaac Rodder has gone to France. So essentially 3 guys that have been schooled up to play really good test rugby in the most significant position in the pack have disappeared. So I would say, who would I get back from overseas? Definitely be a toss-up. Adam Coleman and Isaac Rodder, perhaps you'd get 2 big locks in. Now, perhaps that leads to Samu Kerevi, who had a good World Cup last year and has improved significantly, but there's more depth in the centres in Australia than perhaps those lock positions where you have to compete against the big brawny test sides of other nations. So it's going to be quite the thing to debate who comes in. Is it Kerevi or one of the locks?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, as much as Atolu Latu had a great World Cup, we've got some depth at hooker, and I'd love to see Jordan Ulesi and Folau Fainga battling it out for that spot. You can make an argument for Sean McMahon and for Kerevi, probably our 2 best players playing overseas, but we do have depth in those positions. So it is the locks I'd be looking at as well. For what it's worth, I'd be going Rory Arnold, but I'd also be looking at Scott Fardy. He was named in the Pro 14 Team of the Year as a lock this week. He's been unbelievable for Leinster over there for the last 2 or 3 years, kind of forgotten in Australian rugby, but had such a big impact in that Wallabies jersey. A bit of a late bloomer, and I reckon Rory Arnold and Scott Fardy would have a huge impact on this squad. And just quickly to your point, one of the quotes here from Dave Rennie in the article says, "First and foremost, it's crucial we recognise those players who are currently making a daily contribution to rugby in Australia. That will be reflected in the squad we name for this year's test season. We have the chance to select 1 or 2 players based overseas who don't meet that criteria. We are looking long-term, though, and we want to bring players back to play Super Rugby here in Australia. So very consistent with his predecessor, Michael Checker, in that he wants the best Australians playing their rugby here, which is really good to see. Staying with rugby union, Super Rugby AU semi-final tomorrow night at Suncorp Stadium. I'm looking forward to heading down for that one. It's the Melbourne Rebels in their first ever playoff match in their 10-year existence, coming up against the Queensland Reds, who, let's be honest, it feels like a lifetime ago that they played finals. So plenty on the line for each of those teams. Sydney Morning Herald journalist Tom Decent written up a story looking at the selection of match day 23s from both the Reds and the Rebels. The Reds going with an unchanged starting lineup, and they bring Alex Murphy back onto the bench, who returns from a hamstring injury. The Rebels making 3 changes from last week, and the most interesting change, I think, sees Richard Hardwick and Brad Wilkin both selected in the back row alongside Isi Nasserani, 2 traditional flankers, 2 traditional sevens, perhaps in that pooper style that we saw the Wallabies with David Pocock and Michael Hooper in recent years. Rebels coach Dave Vessels says that selection is based on the fact that they think the Reds back row is probably their primary threat. Therefore, we've elected to play 2 sevens. Some of the stuff they've done around the breakdown gives them a lot of energy, and we picked 2 sevens to put some pressure on the ball ourselves. Do you think this is good selection from Dave Vessels to fight fire with fire in the back row? And how do you see this match playing out, Jim?
Yeah, I think it's good selection from Vessels. I don't believe, Wilkin's been perhaps picked for his ginger mullet. That brings in the girls, I'm sure. But Hardwick and Wilkin, they have different strengths even than McWright and Liam Wright, who have such on-the-ball presence, but pilfering, forced penalties. The Queensland duo have been excellent this year, and there's no doubt that's a super part of the energy that Queensland get. I think it'll be a terrific match. You say the Rebels have never made a final. For this Queensland team, it's almost the same, never made a final, because the last final appearance from the Queensland Reds was way back in 2013. So new territory, but I think the Reds will feed off the fact they're playing at Suncorp Stadium. One of the things they set up at the start of the year was to turn it more into a four. It had really been open house for visiting teams for a long time, and they have had that consistency of victory in front of their fans at Suncorp Stadium. I think the numbers will go up too. They're allowing over 25,000 into the ground. I don't think they'll get that many. I think more like the 15 to 18,000. Love to see over 20, and that'd be a great showcase for Australian rugby in general. I think the Reds just have too much firepower and too much organised firepower. I think Tate McDermott had a great skirmish last weekend with Nick White from the Brumbies. That was a terrific matchup. I think you saw there perhaps the 2 of the halfbacks that'll be in Dave Rennie's squad. So I think Tate McDermott, a real ripper of a halfback, and I think he'll be significant just keeping the tempo going against the Rebels.
Yeah, battle I'm looking forward to seeing as well as the battle of the 10s, Matt Tamua, James O'Connor. Essentially a shootout for that Wallaby 10 jersey. We know that Dave Rennie has said he sees Tamua more as a 12, but Tamua has also said he would prefer to play 10. And just thinking about it as we talk now, this will be James O'Connor's first Super Rugby final as well, having played for the Reds, the Rebels and the Western Force. So exciting for him. He's had a wonderful season and is playing some excellent football and seems in a good place with his football. Our third story today, and we stay in Queensland, but we're looking at the AFL and how clubs are looking to try and prevent any issues happening off the field with their players once they leave that hub environment at the conclusion of the season and continue their stay in Queensland. Essentially what we've got is a lot of players from interstate, obviously based here in hub environments in Queensland for many months. Teams who don't play finals will finish up next weekend, and a lot of those players saying, well, there's not much point flying back to Victoria, for example, and entering a lockdown. I'm in Queensland, I'm COVID safe, I've done my quarantine, so I'm going to go and have a holiday here in Queensland where I can go to restaurants, go to cafes, jump in a car, drive up the coast, even jump on a plane and head far north if I want to. The concern from an AFL standpoint is the risk of players behaving badly. The Queensland government's invested a lot of money to bring players into hubs, and the optics of those players misbehaving while the rest of the country is under lockdown or restrictions would be really, really bad for the AFL. And they're looking at the different ways in which they might be able to get ahead of the fact and prevent player misbehaviour. One of the options floated, according to Tom Morris at foxsports.com.au, was for players to pay a bond in advance, a good behaviour bond, which would be refunded once they got through the season unscathed. Unsurprisingly, the AFL Players Association not super keen on that idea. Collingwood President Eddie Maguire has suggested minders, plainclothes police officers and other minders to help keep players out of trouble this off-season. Maguire said that clubs regularly use chaperones to help keep their players safe when they're overseas. Didn't rule out the strategy being used in Queensland. And a quote here from Eddie Maguire: all clubs have hired in the past off-duty police officers or club officials to chaperone and keep an eye on everybody, particularly when they're overseas and in Las Vegas of all places. Well, we are in Vegas, aren't we, for the next couple of months? Jim, how inevitable is it that we're going to see off-season incidents, not only in the AFL but in the NRL, where players have had such tight restrictions? And how do the codes get ahead of the fact while also respecting the fact that these players are adults?
This is a major issue. I mean, speak to any coach and they'll tell you the off-season is the enemy, because after all that structure and all that timetabling and getting to meetings and trainings on time, suddenly free, we can do whatever we like. So the issue is there, and there will be blow-ups without doubt. I think the bond idea is ridiculous. That just paints everyone with a broad brush as you're a culprit, you're going to mess up. And that's unfair to the many, many players who have a very sensible and enjoyable way of just finishing a season and just being normal human beings. But I think the chaperone idea has to be in play. And that's just standard practice. Like if you've got a group of guys going out, you do have someone looking out for them. One thing I'd have to say is that a lot of these AFL players have their wives up here and their girlfriends, or I won't say wives and girlfriends, wives or girlfriends up here. And I'm thinking that they'll be together. So it's partners going out. And so it's a different environment to 10 AFL players going to Las Vegas and getting into the trouble we all know happens over there. So there might be some common sense by the fact that players are with their partners and going to have a good time, a holiday at Hamilton Island or going up to Cairns or driving out bush. But that's getting away from the point. There's going to be a blow-up, young guys blowing off steam, getting on the drink, having too many kebabs, whatever. It's just going to be a drama and terrible look. Queensland government, Queensland's opened their arms to the AFL to do the right thing, and it's on the AFL to police it, no one else. And the players, they have some common sense that they've been given a privileged position, even though they've been in lockdown, and everyone understands it's been incredibly difficult. But there's got to be some common sense beyond the norm.
Yeah, well said. I think we talk about, players, when that structure finishes at the end of the season, that's when the trouble begins. In this current environment, the season has been multiplied by 10,000 in terms of the intensity and the inability to get that release. So hopefully they can come up with a good solution that respects the players as adults, provides some support, because we know there are people out there who will see them out and about and see an opportunity to start trouble as well. And hopefully we can keep the trouble to an absolute minimum. These guys are adults and they'll behave like it, hopefully. Our penultimate story today, yes, we're both Leeds United fans, but it is without a doubt the biggest story heading into the English Premier League this year. The return of Leeds United, the fallen giants, 16 years out of the top flight. You throw into the mix Marcelo Bielsa, one of the most captivating managers in the history of world football, making his Premier League bow. I think it goes without saying that Leeds have been the biggest club outside of the Premier League for the 16 years they've been out of it. Massive game this week. It's not pulled out of a hat that you see Liverpool hosting Leeds at Anfield on the first weekend. And a wonderful story from BBC Sport analysing the history of Marcelo Bielsa. And for those who don't know much about this man, he is one in a million. Make sure you read the story. We'll link that underneath the video on Twitter. With the Premier League returning this weekend, Jim, how big of a boost is the return of Leeds United, and what other storylines are you looking to follow?
Well, I think Leeds United, as you mentioned, big club, and I have to reveal my true colours here, if I can, Pete.
Fantastic.
I've got to say, everyone knows Ellen Road. as a home base for Leeds, and to see it thumping and packed with a full house will be brilliant. And this is one of the total appeals of the Premier League, that it does have clubs that are down and they have a resurgence. Now, I think the best part about Leeds is they don't look like a one-year club up and then history. They've got a really good squad. I think one of the younger average ages in the Premier League, I think around 24 as an average age. So they've got that profile of a team on the rise. One of the manager's great skills is for this whole promotion is that he's been a manager for 30 years. So he's seen everything coming in from France and in Europe, and he's an experienced manager. So that will give a lot of calm to the players. And they've got some really good ones. Rodrigo, Calvin Phillips, players like that, they're high-quality players. So they've got a lineup that can make an instant impact. Will it be immediately against Liverpool? You'd say, oh, that's just a Liverpool win. But that is the total appeal of the Premier League, that anything can happen. And people will be watching this match. Leeds are back.
Yeah, we saw Norwich City, of course, defeating Manchester City last year, which was one of the biggest upsets, and then they still went down by some way. But Leeds absolutely a chance at Anfield. For what it's worth, from a storyline perspective, for me, it's the battle for the Champions League again. I mean, you've got Chelsea who've invested enormous sums of money. There'll be pressure that comes on Frank Lampard instantly. You've got Liverpool, who were just so good last year. Manchester City has Pep Guardiola's shine rubbed off. We'll see how they bounce back. You've got Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's Manchester United, who look to be on the right track. You've got Arsenal under Mikel Arteta, who has that team tracking in the right direction. I'm going to throw a smoky in the mix. Everton, finally buying some midfielders, and James Rodriguez and Allen and Abdoulaye Doucouré coming in the last week under the tutelage of Carlo Ancelotti. Don't rule them out being in that top six hunt as well. Our final story today, well, it's not so much a story, but it's a bit of fun that we like to have on a Friday. The NFL, of course, kicking off this morning in the US, but we'll have to wait until Monday morning to see New England Patriots legend Tom Brady making his debut for his new team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Nobody ever thought they would see the day where Brady would represent a different team at age 41, I think, off the top of my head. Pretty remarkable. And Jim, it's got us thinking, who are some of the iconic players in different leagues all over the world who've swapped teams at the very back end of their career? I've got three up my sleeve, but I'd love to hear yours.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll stick with American sports, and maybe David Beckham. Beckham had that amazing move to the LA Galaxy, and he was early 30s, probably earlier than many thought when he'd first flip over, but he was still playing there when he was 36, 37 and played close to 100 games. So in terms of American football, Beckham has a real pedigree in that space. And of course, there was the Hollywood flashiness with his wife, with Posh and whatever. So that was a fun story. Swervin' Mervyn Hughes, I love that story. His belly was expanding, but he was still the grunt man. And he went down at sort of 36, 37 to the Canberra Comets. And they were a battling outfit, but they had a big win when Ricky Ponting and his Tassie Tigers went down to Manuka Oval, of all places. Merv's taken a couple of wickets and they knocked off Tasmania. So they're the fairy tale matches that you really love to see from older senior statesmen, and they can still do it. Maybe not as often, but they can still do it.
Yeah,
your choices, maybe?
Yeah, I love Merv Hughes, and I think Mike Valletta was the other one coaxed out of retirement to play for that Canberra Comets team as well. RIP to the Canberra Comets. They had a short-term existence in the Mercantile Mutual Cup, but I don't know how Bill Laurie would have found commentating on such a proud Victoria than Merv Hughes when he was playing for another state or territory. Two more for me. Wayne Carey, North Melbourne superstar, the king. We know the circumstances under which he left that football club, but it just felt bizarre watching him play his last 18 months of football for the Adelaide Crows. That was one that always just felt a little bit off. And Peter Schmeichel, the Danish goalkeeper, a legend of Manchester United, possibly the greatest goalkeeper in the history of the Premier League, and him coming back at the end of his career to play for Manchester City, the arch rivals across the other side of town. You don't see that very often, of course. Football, we know what rivalries are like with Luis Figo when he went from Barcelona to Real Madrid and had the pig's head thrown at him at the Nou Camp thrown when he was taking a corner. So there are a couple that spring to mind for mine. Jim, fantastic to catch up, mate. We always have a lot of fun on a Friday. I'm looking forward to seeing you down at Suncorp Stadium tomorrow night. Have a great weekend and look forward to catching up with you again on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff very soon.
Reds versus Leeds. What about that for a double on the betting for the weekend? Reds Leeds.
Reds Leeds, and I'll tell you what, if you're watching the Reds at 7:15 and going through to watch Leeds beat the other Reds at 2:30 a.m., make sure you're drinking plenty of water and eating lots of food. Fantastic, Jim. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.